the missile that was powered by a nuclear reactor. I still remember the day I first laid eyes on the heart of Teller's nightmare, the prototype ramjet engine that would one day sit at the nose of a missile powered by a nuclear reactor. It was late 1964, at the Nevada test site, in a cavernous hangar carved into limestone, half lit by orange sodium vapor lamps. The air smelled of grease, ozone, and desert dust. Technicians in grease-stained coveralls brushed ash from their shoulders. Engineers huddled over consoles the size of church pews, lit by fluorescent strips that flickered like distant strobe lights. In the center of it all, mounted on a test stand nearly 2 stories high, loomed the steel shell of a streamlined fuselage section, half a locomotive boiler and half a fighter jet intake. This was Tory 2C, the nuclear ramjet engine at the core of the supersonic low-altitude missile, or SLAM. Our project director, Colonel Harold Jacobs, led me around the stand. He was tall and skeletal, his white hair combed back in a perfect ridge. "You're looking at the future of deterrence," he said, voice low enough to carry over the test stand pumps. "A missile that never runs out of fuel, that cruises at Mach 3 at treetop level, carrying a dozen thermonuclear warheads across continents and oceans. And it's powered by the same reactor design that lights a submarine. Except this one leaves a trail of fallout wherever it flies." He paused, and I caught the glint of pride and fear in his eyes. Project Pluto, as this program was codenamed, began in 1957 under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission and the Air Force's Weapons Systems Division. At its inception, the objective seemed simple on paper: harness a compact nuclear reactor to heat incoming air, then expel it at supersonic speeds. The result would be an engine capable of indefinite range, unburdened by chemical propellants. Experts in Los Alamos had just demonstrated compact reactor cores small enough to sit on a mobile test rig. A team led by Dr. Ted Merkel, a mild-mannered physicist from the University of Chicago, believed they could miniaturize the nuclear pile further, shape it into a form factor for a missile fuselage, and keep it stable at thousands of degrees Celsius. I came to the program in early 1963, fresh from my doctorate in nuclear physics. I was assigned to the Reactor Technology Group, tasked with designing the fuel elements for Tory 2C. We used zirconium-clad uranium oxide cylinders filled with highly enriched uranium stacked like logs in a steel furnace. Between them, we inserted beryllium moderator plates to slow neutrons, spark fission, and sustain a controlled chain reaction. The challenge was making the assembly compact, heat-resistant, and able to survive the G-forces of launch. Each fuel rod had to be coated in pyrolytic carbon, then polished to a mirror finish to prevent oxidation in the scorching airflow. We literally burned our fingers in lab tests, handling rods so hot they glowed orange, then submerging them in water to check for micro cracks. I remember one night in late December 1963, Dr. Merkel found me crouched at my bench near the radiochemistry scrubbers, plucking tiny flakes of metal from a failed fuel slug. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "We're not making missiles of Christmas," he said, nodding at the spilled uranium oxide. "But if we don't perfect these rods, our reactor will throw a chain reaction hard enough to crack itself in two. We need uniform porosity, no hotspots. Our lives depend on it." He didn't say our lives, he just implied it. Because once that reactor fired, no pilot would be there to shut it down. The missile would run until the fuel was gone, or until the reactor core disassembled in a nuclear meltdown at thousands of feet altitude. In March 1964, the first ground test of Tory 2C began at the test cell CAD, a bunker of reinforced concrete nestled in Frenchman Flat. The reactor was assembled inside the chamber with a massive smoke ejector fan system hooked to towering exhaust stacks. We loaded the uranium slugs into graphite reflectors and closed the heavy steel lid. Cameras behind leaded glass recorded every gauge. Outside, sirens shrieked as a countdown started. 10 minutes of warm-up, radiator pumps circulating liquid sodium coolant, control drums rotating to throttle the chain reaction. At 0 hour, power surged. The neutron flux monitors glowed green, then amber. The engineers in the bunker cheered. Then the real test, opening the intake valves to simulate high-speed airflow. A fireball hissed behind the reactor. Then a jet of white-hot exhaust roared through the stack, sounding like a supersonic blowtorch. Radiation monitors spiked for seconds before returning to baseline. We had just run a nuclear reactor at jet thrust conditions, and the world was a stranger place. Behind the scenes, politics and paranoia dictated the program's future. President Johnson, fresh from the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, feared the Soviet nuclear triad, growing at an alarming rate. The SLAM missile promised a doomsday storm of nuclear warheads, a weapon that needed no staging bases, could not be stopped by conventional interceptors, and would carpet entire target zones with fallout. Strategic Air Command brass coveted it as the ultimate deterrent. But within the Beltway, critics worried about safety, cost, tens of billions in today's dollars, and moral hazard. A weapon that littered the landscape with radiation defied the Geneva Convention's limits on indiscriminate destruction. Senators on the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy asked pointed questions. Do we really want to irradiate Northern Europe and the Soviet steppes if we ever launch one of these things? Back at Area 51, I worked alongside Air Force Major Linda Reyes, a propulsion specialist with a knack for data analysis. She pored over pressure and temperature transient data from each test. Sometimes at dawn, you'd find her sipping stale coffee in the control shack, eyes red from hours in front of oscilloscopes. She once confided to me, "I didn't sign up to be a footnote in history. My mother told me to do something useful, not lethal. Every time they fire this reactor, they puff out plutonium isotopes we can't recall. We're gumming up the sky with cancer seeds." I took her words to heart. In my private journals, I wrote about the toxic plumes trailing from the stack, a gray haze that drifted across the desert for miles, leaving radiation pickups on Geiger counters perched on distant hills. In August 1964, with toss weight calculations complete, the Air Force prepped the first flight test. Airplanes carrying Tory the 2C would carry the engine aloft, then fire it in the sky, feeding a high-speed turbine to confirm performance in real atmospheric conditions. The mothership was a B-52 bomber, stripped of armaments and refitted with mounting pylons under its wings. On the morning of the test, the bomber taxied out under low ceilings of stratocumulus. The missile body hung like a bomb, its reactor compartment gleaming under floodlights. Crews climbed ladders to bolt the dorsal latches, while range safety officers triple-checked the flight path to ensure the test line ran over uninhabited desert and into the open ocean. Lieutenant Colonel James Jimbo Whitman flew the bomber. In the cockpit, he checked his instruments and spoke into the intercom. "All stations report ready for nuclear propulsion test. We go hot over range Mark 27. Below, technicians activated the reactor, cycling control drums to criticality. At the missile's tail, the ramjet combustor glowed faintly orange, as 400 MMD of thermal power moved supersonic airflow through the core. Whitman pushed the release button. Tory the CUC dropped into a steep dive towards the pre-surveyed test corridor. I watched on radar screens as the engine ignited, its plume shining like a luminous spear in the morning sky. Speed climbed. Mach 1.2, Mach 1.5, Mach 2. Then a panic alarm shrieked. Reactor outlet temperatures spiked beyond safe limits. Whitman engaged the abort sequence, flipping switches that inserted neutron-absorbing rods into the core. The reactor coughed, choked on its own shutdown sequence, and the missile rolled into a glide, eventually splashing into the Pacific, where the crew's remote visual systems confirmed the core had shut down without meltdown. Though technically successful, the flight test stoked both wonder and dread. The Soviets monitored fallout levels in the Bering Sea, detecting isotopic signatures only a reactor could produce. Environmentalists in California's Central Valley found elevated radiation in lettuce fields, traced back to the test day. Ranchers near Mercury, NV, reported dead cattle, though official records called it unrelated disease. Press coverage remained tightly controlled, blacked out by security orders. But in D.C., photos of the reactor's glowing exhaust leaked to the New York Times, provoking a Senate subcommittee hearing where Colonel Jacobs defended the program as necessary to maintain credible deterrence. As the Vietnam War escalated, budgets tightened. Secretary of Defense McNamara, determined to cut waste, assembled a white paper on exotic weapons. He cited technical hurdles: too heavy, too costly, too environmentally catastrophic. He noted that submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, had matured, faster, cheaper, less visible than a flying reactor. In June 1965, Defense Secretary McNamara delivered his verdict. Project Pluto was to be scrapped. The last Tory 2C hardware would be dismantled. Nuclear fuel rods shipped to Hanford for reprocessing. Test cells decommissioned. Budgets reallocated to Minuteman missile silos. Some engineers wept. Others, like Dr. Merkel, simply nodded, head bowed, and packed their papers into cardboard boxes. But the ghost of the nuclear-powered missile haunted the next generation. In the Soviet Union, parallel programs, Project 189 and Chelomey's OKB-52, pursued nuclear ramjet designs for cruise missiles. By 1968, they too had ground-tested reactor cores. The Russians talked of a Buran-2 nuclear cruiser missile capable of breaching NATO's missile defenses in a nuclear winter. Though their program ended in 1970 as well, it fueled paranoia and arms race rhetoric through the 1970s and 1980s. In personal conversations decades later, Major Reyes confided that she kept a scrap of pyrolytic carbon cladding from those early fuel rods. She stuck it in a display case next to her CIA retirement plaques. "That little carbon chip," she said, voice low, "is proof that we almost solved energy problems with nuclear breath, but we would have damned the world with the fallout." She paused. "It wasn't just a missile. It was a moment when we decided technology outranked morality." Today, the idea of powering a missile with a nuclear reactor sounds like the stuff of apocalypse fantasy. Yet, the background radiation from early tests lingers in desert sands, still detectable if you know where to look. Satellite bird's-eye surveys of test areas show unusual cratering and soil discoloration. Recent documentaries have unearthed declassified footage of reactor tests in Frenchman Flat. Black and white film of technicians in silver suits walking near a roaring plume. Some show unmarked trucks hauling core assemblies under blackout conditions. They run just a few seconds of footage, then cut to chilling interviews with scientists who speak only on condition of anonymity. Beyond the technical and political, the story of the nuclear-powered missile also speaks to our collective psychology in the Cold War. The belief that bigger, stranger weapons would secure peace through fear. We flirted with a weapon that could carpet entire continents with radiation, that would keep flying even after the pilot bailed out, that could not be outrun or shot down by any defense we knew. We recognized its power, and then recoiled, realizing that in the end, deterrence must be balanced by restraint. As I reflect on those days in Nevada and Area 51, I feel a strange mix of pride and revulsion. Pride in the ingenuity that turned theory into a half-finished flying reactor, and revulsion at what it meant. An engine of mass death cooled by seals and fast-acting control drums. The world was held back from that edge, but only by politics, budgets, and moral choices. Technology stood ready, humming in a hangar, waiting for the world to decide whether it wanted a missile that never ran out of fuel, but never stopped radiating death. If you've been captivated by this hidden chapter of the nuclear arms race, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into history's strangest weapon programs. And now we want to hear from you. Would you have backed a nuclear-powered missile if you were in President Johnson's shoes? Was the danger worth the deterrent? Drop your thoughts below, and let's wrestle with the ghosts of Project Pluto together.